Welcome to The Bitter Witness.
Don't be scared.
Hello. Welcome back. I'm Rebecca, and I'm your host for The Bitter Witness. I hope you've had a good week. I've had a great week. I'm co-directing the next production at my community theater with one of my dear friends. Love you, Glossy. We've started rehearsals, and I'm just so happy. I love being in the theater. This production is a huge undertaking for everyone involved. We are doing our very first Broadway production at our theater. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done, and it is just so much fun. We are all having a blast with this. There's so much laughter, and the best part about a community theater is the relationships that you create and keep well past the curtain coming down for the last time. When you make a friend in community theater, you have made a friend for life. It's so awesome. Let's see, what else is happening? Oh, one of my boys came home for a few days. This one lives in Ottawa, so he's about 8 hours away from me. So while he's home, he comes and asks if I'd give him a ride to a party. And of course I say yes, and off we go. Well, when we get to where we're going, I said, "Are you staying overnight here?" And he says, "Yeah, no worries, but can you come back and get me in the morning?" I said, "Yep, I'll see you in the morning." He shuts the door and off I go, belting out my songs and singing my heart out as I make my way back home. Well, about 2 a.m., the dogs are whining in the front window. And Patterson, that's my partner. Have I ever told you his name? Anyway, Patterson is thinking there's a skunk or a bunny rabbit out on the front lawn. It happens all the time. Anyway, I'm asleep because 2 a.m. He's looking out the front window with the dogs and there's nothing there. But suddenly he hears a loud crashing sound from the bathroom behind him on the main level. He goes to the bathroom, turns on the light, only to see my son Cole half in, half out of the bathroom window. They kind of stare at each other for a moment, and then Patterson says, "Well, are you coming in or are you going out?" Cole says, I'm a little stuck." He was stuck in the bathroom window. Oh, I love having boys. So between the two of them, they figured out how to get Cole unstuck from the window and back out into the laneway, and Patterson goes around and unlocked the front door for him. Apparently, I forgot to tell him the code to get in the door. Oops. I bought one of those number padlocks for the house because now that the boys are all older, they're coming and going at all hours, and I like to keep the door locked because a few of our neighbors have had some strange people walk into their houses and help themselves to some of their stuff. But I guess getting the number lock only works if you let everyone know the code. And I also want to know how he got in the bathroom window. I keep it locked. I'm not sure if this makes me proud that my son was able to solve his problem on his own, or if I should worry about what he's doing up there in Ottawa if he can get past our locks. He came home because it was my birthday this weekend, and I am fortunate enough to share my birthday with my eldest son. So my oldest son turned 30 this year, and I have to tell you that when I woke up on Saturday morning and realized that I was now the mother of a 30-year-old, I swear to God, I got pains in my body. Not pains from stress, but like pains from age, you know? I'm not old enough to have a 30-year-old son. How is this happening to me? Well, that's about it for around here in my little corner of Ontario. Let's move on to the business. If you enjoy this episode or any episode, please subscribe and like the show on whatever platform you're listening on. I found out this week that the more followers, the better the show does in the algorithm, which is something I don't understand. But if you feel like doing more for the show, you can head over to Patreon and support the show. Just for a few cents a day, you can help to make my dreams come true at the very least, to keep the lights and the internet on so I can continue to bring you amazing content. That's enough of the business. The dogs are sleeping behind me, so puppy snoring ASMR will be brought to you by both Miley and Piper today. So grab a cup of tea. You better make it a thermos of tea, because this story is a roller fucking coaster. Sit back and relax while I tell you about the case of Dan and Betty Broderick. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorn. This line from the 1697 play The Mourning Bride by William Congreve reveals a profound truth about the depths of human emotion, specifically when betrayal and heartache intertwine. The idiom captures the essence of wounded pride and the intense pain suffered when trust is broken between the sacred bond of partners. We are all guilty of wishing ill will on those who have wronged us in some way. But the majority of us are capable of processing our inner thoughts and feelings without succumbing to abuse and violence. However, there exists a darker reality for a small segment of the population, where emotions escalate beyond reason, leading them down a treacherous and dark path. While traversing this path, anger and rage become blinding forces that overshadow logic and rationale. The pain inflicted by those who are consumed by revenge and rage is not only physical, but emotional. It has the ability to reverberate through communities and generations, leaving both visible and invisible scars. Invisible scars that are often as profound as any wound. The consequences of such unchecked fury can be catastrophic, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake, families shredded, friendships fragmented, and in some extreme cases, lives lost. Thus, the challenge lies in confronting the instincts that rise within us when we are hurt, and learning to channel that energy in ways that restore rather than destroy. Betty Broderick is one such woman who allowed her rage and yearning for revenge to consume her. The path of destruction she left in her wake can still be felt to this day by those who she was supposed to protect, love, and cherish. As always, I want to give the victims in this case top billing. However, like many of our other cases, this case has created a number of victims. So to all those affected by the Broderick case, I acknowledge you and I send my love to you wherever you may be. Betty Broderick was born Elizabeth Ann Biseglia on November 7th, 1947 in Brooklyn, New York. Betty was the third of 6 children to Frank and Marita Biseglia. She was raised in a devout Catholic family, and according to Betty, it was instilled in her to go to Catholic schools, be careful with dating until you find a Catholic man, support him while he works, be blessed in your later years with beautiful grandchildren. She stated that she never really had a chance to rebel against her parents because all the friends that she was allowed to associate with were also raised with the same values. In essence, Betty was raised to be a housewife. And there is nothing wrong with being a housewife, as long as that is what you choose to be of your own free will without anyone else telling you what to do. Dan Broderick was the oldest son and also from a large, devout Catholic family. I couldn't find too much information about Dan's family. Most of the media attention fell onto Betty. Betty was a college freshman at the time. She was 17 and met a handsome young Dan Broderick at a Notre Dame football game. Dan was a pre-med senior at Notre Dame. He introduced himself to Betty at an after-party by writing on a napkin, Daniel T. Broderick III, MDA. When Betty asked him what MDA meant, his response was, medical doctor, almost. They then began dating and not long after became engaged. The couple were married on April 12, 1969, at the Immaculate Conception Church in East Chester in a lavish ceremony planned by Betty's mother. They honeymooned on a Caribbean cruise. Side note, I don't think I'm ever going to be able to take a cruise. I am terrified of the ocean. I've been watching way too many of those North Sea TikToks. Betty returned from her honeymoon pregnant with her first child, a daughter, Kim, and she continued to work until the day before she gave birth. Afterward, she continued to hold down several jobs and devoted herself to home and motherhood, which, she stated, had always been her only ambitions. She gave birth to 4 more children, a daughter, Lee, 2 sons named Daniel and Rhett, and an unnamed boy who died 2 days after birth. During this time, the family was basically destitute. For a period of time, they were living on food stamps. They never really had a home. They would move in and out of dormitories and apartments. Betty held down a multitude of jobs to support her new family. She even sold Tupperware door to door in the cold New York winter while holding her babies in her arms. Betty was never too proud to work, and she was doing everything she could to hold the family together and keep their heads above water while Dan was finishing his schooling. After Kim was born, Dan graduated with his medical degree, but then he decided he wanted to become a lawyer. He wanted to combine his medical degree and a law degree and become a medical malpractice lawyer. Betty wanted success for her family and her husband, so once again, while Dan was off at school getting his law degree, she supported the family monetarily by taking on any job she could. As well, she continued being the only one who kept the house and kids well looked after. Finally, in 1973, Dan graduated from Harvard Law School. The family moved to the La Jolla, I hope I said that right, area of San Diego. The money did not come pouring in as quickly as what Dan and Betty thought would happen once they moved to California. Dan's initial salary at the law firm where he got his first job was quite meager. After the family moved to California, Dan became obsessed with not only his work, but the social life that he believed was part of becoming one of San Diego's top lawyers. He would arrive at work at 5 a.m. every morning and then spend almost every evening after the office closed out at bars with his associates, trying to plump up his reputation in the law community. Betty saw very little of him during this time, and she was at home cooking, cleaning, and going to work. Through all of this, Dan's wardrobe began to change into designer brand, high-end, expensive clothes. But Betty and the children's clothes were still thrift store brands. As well, Betty didn't own a washer or dryer until way after Dan was done at his first job. So she would have to cart her and the children's clothes to a local laundromat to wash and dry them, while Dan's expensive wardrobe was being dry cleaned. I would be like, "Excuse me, Mr. Ass Hat, I need expensive suits to go to work. You have enough money to buy a ridiculously expensive suit. You have enough money to buy me a washer and dryer. Get on it." There is no way I would be carting 4 young kids to a laundromat to wash my clothes. But that's just me. Betty was fine with it. Betty kept urging Dan to go into practice for himself, and finally he did. After Dan won his first $1 million case, the Brodericks became bona fide millionaires, virtually overnight. And it appeared that after years of hard work and sacrifices, the Brodericks had finally made it. The couple was well known within San Diego social circles and enjoyed a life of increasing affluence. Betty was finally able to quit working and reap the benefits of all her dedication to her husband. According to Betty, as Dan became more and more successful, he demanded more and more of her and ignored more and more of her needs. On one specific occasion, Dan volunteered to be a Boy Scout troop leader. But after one or two meetings, he insisted that Betty take over the position and cover for him because he wouldn't be able to fulfill his obligations because of work. As well, Dan would make the major decisions for the family without including Betty in the process, such as deciding to buy a new home and move the family. Betty was getting really tired of feeling like a single mother when she wasn't one at all. I'm sorry, but if you're my partner and you go out and buy a fucking house without including me, we are going to have issues. You're going to be living in that house by yourself, boy. Betty began to feel second place to Dan's career. She might have been able to manage that if it was only his career. But she started noticing that Dan's interest in her as his wife seemed to be waning as well. Once on a family vacation, a huge fight erupted between the Brodericks when Dan spent more time in the hotel bar than with Betty and the kids. According to articles that I read, Dan was constantly berating Betty for her purchases of furniture and clothing, money that she claimed she had earned while working. But Dan didn't believe her. In turn, Dan never failed to drop an investment in property or on a wardrobe that he claimed he needed as a man of his profession. But with all of this going on, Betty just kept silent and devoted herself to her children and her home. As Dan became more and more successful in his career, he began to try and create a better image of himself, not just with his wardrobe. He exchanged his glasses for contacts, had his hair layered, and had a minor operation to change the shape of his nose. While Dan was doing all this changing, Betty's interest remained solid on her children and her home. Betty made sure the kids were enrolled in the best of schools and took part in as many activities as they possibly could. Betty loved celebrations and holidays, and she threw herself into decorating their home to the tits for every single occasion that she possibly could. Birthdays, Christmas, Halloween, whatever. In an interview, Betty stated, "I was the perfect little Catholic schoolgirl. Marry the man of your dreams who will be a good provider for you and your children. Be beautiful, have a beautiful home, beautiful children, be active in church and community, watch the kids grow, marry them off, and be grandparents. I am not a scorekeeper. Everything we did as a couple, if we were poor together. I viewed everything as us, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Dan never seemed to have that view. We were poor, but he was rich." Some people felt that Betty was a compulsive pleaser. Others felt that she simply was completely in love with Dan. Either way, Betty was at home holding the family together, and this is pretty much when Dan began stepping out. Dan met Linda Kolkina at a party given by lawyer friends in early 1983. Betty attended that party with Dan and overheard him telling another lawyer, "Isn't she beautiful?" and pointed in Linda's direction. Just a passing piece of eye candy at a party. She'll never cross Dan's path again. Or so she thought. But then, after the party in 1983, Dan hired Linda to be his personal assistant. Linda Kolkina was a former airline stewardess and was now a freelance receptionist for another attorney in the firm. She had no paralegal, medical, or medical malpractice insurance experience that would even connect her in any way to Dan. She couldn't even type. Sweet Jesus, that's not a big fucking red flag. That's a giant red blanket flying in Betty's face. And maybe naively, Betty stated that she knew that her husband received many romantic offers from beautiful women, but she never thought that he would take any of the women up on their offers. Betty, at 40 years old at the time, was no stranger to receiving advances from men, but she never considered doing anything with any of them, and she always assumed that Dan would respond in the same way. But we all know what they say about assumptions, right? Assumptions are usually the mother of all fuck-ups. But then Betty started becoming more and more suspicious of Dan and Linda and started badgering Dan about what he was actually doing with Linda and why would he hire someone who couldn't type to be his personal assistant. Dan would tell Betty that she was imagining things, and when he got pissed off enough about her badgering, he would tell her, "Lots of women are waiting in line to replace you." You know what? Fuck you, Dan. That fall, consumed by her suspicions, Betty phoned one of Dan's paralegals and asked her outright what she knew of Linda and Dan's relationship. The woman denied knowing anything only because she did not want to get into her boss's marital issues. But after the call with Betty, the paralegal went to Dan and told him he should be honest with his wife and do the right thing. Dan fired that paralegal on the spot. Dan denied his affair with Linda for a while, but eventually Dan's 39th birthday came. Betty went to his office to celebrate his birthday with him and was informed that Dan and Linda had just stepped out. After waiting all day and most of the evening at his office, Betty drove home furious. Once she got home, she decided she would have a bonfire. And for kindling, she used every single one of Dan's extremely expensive custom-made suits, added a little gasoline, and lit a match. The thing is that while Betty was enjoying her little bonfire in the backyard, her children were standing by and had watched her screaming in hysterical fury as she carted all of the suits out to the backyard, poured the gasoline on, and lit the match. And all the kids could do was cry. Okay, this shouldn't have been done in front of the kids, but I can't say I blame her. I bet burning those suits was cathartic as fuck for her. I have to say, at my divorce party, oh yeah, I had a divorce party. There was a live band, a horse trough full of beer, and the main attraction of the night was me burning my wedding dress on a stake. I have pictures. I have to say, it felt fucking wonderful to watch that dress and all it represented go up in flames. When Dan returned home that night, after Betty had burned all of his suits, there was no fighting. He just remained quiet except for when he told Betty that she had an overactive imagination and him having an affair with Linda was all in her head. I don't like to speak ill of the dead, but get right fucked, Dan. In reality, Dan and Linda had began their affair pretty much right after he had hired her as his personal assistant. The two carried on this affair in secret for about 3 years. And after those 3 years, Dan decided he was ready to ask Betty for a separation. On the last day of February 1984, Dan finally confessed his affair. Not as an apology to Betty, only to explain it as the reason why he was seeking a separation. But right before Dan asked Betty for the separation, he had moved the family to a rental house in the nearby town of La Jolla, while their home in Coral Reef, which I believe is like a suburb, was being repaired. A large crack had been detected in its foundation. Ironic. Once he had asked Betty for the separation, Dan conveniently moved back into the house in Coral Reef and left Betty and the kids in the rental house in La Jolla. Well, that worked out nicely for Dan, didn't it? Betty was a woman scorned. Not just scorned, Betty was burnt. She was covered in batter and deep fried. After everything that she had done for Dan, he just tossed her to the side for a younger, prettier woman. And just a little side note here, which is kind of creepy, there is a striking similarity between Betty and Linda. I'll post a side-by-side of the two women on the Facebook page. It's a little unsettling. Dan proceeded to redecorate the house in Coral Reef to his own taste and did not consult Betty before changing anything in the family house. He also refused to spend time with the children, and he would only spend time with them when Betty would literally drop them on his doorstep and run. Now, by law, Dan was obligated to pay all the family bills because he was the breadwinner. But he didn't pay any of Betty's bills. He gave her a small allowance of his decision how much and told her, "You'll have to make do," while he lived a life of luxury with his millions in the family home that Betty decorated and kept going. As well, his relationship with Linda started getting more serious. To say this divorce got ugly would be the understatement of the century. Dan was a lawyer, and he was a good lawyer. Betty never stood a chance, and she was pissed. Like, pissed. Right from the get-go, Dan started drowning Betty with petty legal motions, trying to get that he got exactly what he wanted out of the divorce and Betty got nothing. Betty wasn't taking this in stride. One afternoon, she stopped at the house in Coral Reef to visit the children, and she spotted a homemade Boston cream pie, which was always Dan's favorite. It was sitting on the kitchen counter. She asked the housekeeper, where did the pie come from? The housekeeper told her that Linda had dropped it off for Dan. Betty proceeded to carry the pie upstairs and, with a smile, spread the entire pie across Dan's bed and his closet full of clothes. Dan, arriving home, surveyed the damage and immediately had a restraining order issued to keep his wife off the premises. Oh my God, could you imagine the smell after about an hour or so inside a house of cream pie? Oh God, that's gross. 2 days later, and completely infuriated by the restraining order, which told her she couldn't step foot in the house, her house, Betty threw a wine bottle through a window of the house in Coral Reef. Police were called, but the officers who responded refused to become involved in what they decided was just another domestic battle among the idle rich. Cowards. Maybe if they had done their fucking job, this case wouldn't have ended the way it did. Things just kept going down this really bad road for Betty. She was diving deeper and deeper into her rage. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't psychotic. She was just downright pissed. Like pissed as though she dropped her croissant in a shit pile pissed. Betty stated in an interview that if Dan had been honest with her from the start, she may have better coped. But he seemed to be playing and enjoying the mind games. Betty stated, "I had no desire to leave my home, marriage, and children. If he had been discreet, He could have kept Linda, but he was trying to force me into divorcing him so he could always appear the good guy. He maneuvered us into a rental house and a rental car, both in his name, and he ended up with our house with the equity. Master manipulator of money, truth, people, courts, facts. It was very scary, unquote. Betty had nothing but headaches and issues when she was trying to find a lawyer to represent her for the divorce. Mostly because almost all of the town's best divorce and property lawyers were also Dan's best friends. Her first choice for counsel had been a mutual friend named Tom Ashworth, but he politely refused her case, explaining that he had been appointed as a judge and was not accepting any new cases. However, not long after that, she encountered Ashworth again. This time, he was representing Dan in the early stages of the divorce. She was literally forced to turn to Los Angeles to find a lawyer who dared represent her against Dan. She found one in Beverly Hills by the name of Daniel Jaffe, and Jaffe was considered a top-ranking divorce attorney. But Daniel had probably taken off more than he could chew by taking Betty on as a client. He told her to stop with the violent outbursts in front of neighbors and the children when Dan would drop the kids off. As well, he told her to obey the restraining order. But Betty was not going to sit idly by while the tart Linda was living in her house with her husband and she was stuck in a rental. Jaffe told Betty that if she kept acting this way, she wouldn't be able to get a fair trial when they finally got into court. But his pleas just fell on Betty's deaf ears, and she continued on doing Betty. One weekend, Betty found out that Dan had taken Linda away for a weekend, so she went over to the house in Coral Reef and smashed a few windows, just as a fuck you to both Dan and Linda. But like I said, Dan was a really good lawyer, and in retaliation against Betty for all the things she was doing to him, he used the law. He dragged Betty into court every time she did something to him on a court order called Order to Show Cause. Each time Dan went to court, Betty had to go before a judge and try and explain why she shouldn't be held in contempt of court for violating the restraining order. By the time they actually got to court for the divorce, Dan literally had a list of violations longer than Santa's naughty and nice lists. The list included the cream pie incident, the windows, a tossed toaster, a smashed stereo switch, a broken bedroom mirror, even more smashed windows, holes in the wall from hammering, answering machine smashed by a hammer, spray painting the interior walls of Dan's house, and several other items. And Dan didn't miss one opportunity to haul Betty in front of the judge. Betty wasn't helping herself by doing all this shit, but she just would not stop. When they finally got to divorce court, Dan entered the huge list of Betty's violations into evidence, and it was literally a timeline of the separation. And from the judge's perspective, Betty was the aggressor. While all this was happening, Betty's lawyer, Daniel Jaffe, gave her an ultimatum: either live by the rules of the restraining order or he was out. Betty spent Christmas 1985 by herself. Linda and Dan had taken the children on a winter's vacation, and there she sat, feeling alone, unloved, useless, and discarded inside her empty rental house. She couldn't stand another minute of being smothered by that horrible rental house that Dan had banished her to. So to hell with them all anyways. Betty got in the car and drove right to Dan's house. She broke in again and began ripping open every gift-wrapped box marked "To Linda" that lay under Dan's expensive Christmas tree. After tossing the presents all throughout the living room, she then left a Christmas greeting that Dan would be sure to recognize. She thrust a blunt object through the room's mirror and left. In early 1986, not long after Betty had broken in and ruined Christmas, Dan decided to move into another house, to once and for all dump the old place in Coral Reef that reminded him of the days he had determined to forget. You know, those days while his working wife put him through college and took care of his children and his home. Dan bought a 2-story pillared colonial mansion in Balboa Park. But Betty refused to consent to the sale of their matrimonial home. She thought since Dan had bought a new home, why couldn't her and the kids move into the family home and get her out of the rental? But once again, Dan went to court and managed to get a court order to sell the marital residence without Betty's consent. And before Betty knew what was happening, an appointed proxy signed the transaction papers for her, and the house that Betty built was sold right out from under her. Betty was livid. She got into her suburban van and literally crashed through the front door of Dan's brand new home. Dan couldn't restrain his temper any longer. He jumped over the pieces of wood lying all over the foyer of his house and yanked Betty out of the van. He then began slapping Betty repeatedly until the police came. Apparently, Dan had finally had enough. Once the police arrived on scene, they arrested Betty and took her straight to the psych ward, where she was placed on a 72-hour hold. Surprisingly, Betty didn't take too well to being committed for 3 days. She just kept saying, "Look here, he's the crazy one, not me." And after 3 days, Betty was released and sadly had received no help whatsoever from the hospital. Can I just say that I'm shocked that Dan wasn't arrested as well? He was slapping the shit out of her. I know she drove a car through his front door, but I may be the only one with that opinion, and that's fine, but I'm just shocked that they weren't both arrested. There was a hearing scheduled for right after Betty was released from the hospital, but by this time she had long fired Daniel Jaffe and was representing herself. Not a good idea. But she was so pissed about being committed to the hospital that she refused to show up for the hearing. And because Betty didn't show up for court, the judge ruled that she defaulted her claims to all properties and custodies. And with that, Dan took everything he wanted. Full custody of all 4 children, reinstatement of the restraining order against Betty, and a ban on visiting rights for Betty until she submitted to psychiatric care. As for support or alimony, he would continue to pay her what he had been paying her, $9,000 a month, until everything was finalized. Now, to you and me, $9,000 seems like a lot of money. But when you factor in how rich Dan was, that $9,000 was literally like our ex-partners giving us 50 cents a month. $9,000 was nothing to him. That's how rich these guys were. The next several years consisted of what seemed like a series of unending and complex legal maneuverings and manipulations, many of which were suggested to Dan by his lawyer buddies. Betty was jailed twice for contempt. Throughout this entire process, Dan, who was an absolutely brilliant lawyer, took advantage of every loophole in the law, and when Betty would lose her shit because she was always at the losing end of the loopholes, Dan was standing there with a big shit-eating grin on his face, holding a shit shovel so she could dig her shit hole a little deeper. But luckily for Betty, even though she had fired Daniel Jaffe, He had been following the goings-on inside the court case, and he took it upon himself to contact Dan's lawyer and informed him that Betty had a right to be represented in court by someone because she was obviously mentally incapable of defending herself. Daniel informed Dan and Ashworth, his lawyer, that unless they contacted him and informed him of who would be representing Betty's interests in the final steps of the divorce proceedings, which, by the way, would include the division of all property and assets, he would be contacting the bench in San Diego and basically causing a huge shitstorm for Dan legally. This prompted Dan to fork over the money for a retainer for a new lawyer for Betty. What a guy. Betty's new lawyer was William Hargreaves, but sadly, like Daniel Jaffe, Hargreaves would not last long in the position of Betty's representative. Hargreaves is quoted after being fired as saying that Betty was beyond legal help since she couldn't understand that life was possible without Dan. And as for Hargreaves' opinion of Dan the man, Hargreaves stated that he found Dan's drive to control everyone and everything obsessive. He also stated that he was very worried about a violent conclusion to the Broderick battle. And that is called foreshadowing, my friends. Betty was slowly descending into madness, and Dan was fighting with everything he could find within the law. Betty's goal was to make Dan's life as miserable as he had made hers. With all the vicious back and forth, it was really hard to tell who was the aggressor, Dan or Betty. Since Dan had left the marriage, Betty had been leaving vulgar messages on the answering machine, sometimes 2, 3, or more a day. Dan sought out and received court orders ordering Betty to stop leaving messages and verbally assaulting Dan and Linda with her words, but Betty, of course, ignored those orders, and as a result, she spent more nights in jail. But that didn't even stop Betty. This is just a partial transcript of one of the hundreds of messages that Betty left on Dan and Linda's answering machine. Quote, "This is a message to fuckhead and the bitch. You have one hell of a nerve dumping the kids here on the sidewalk and zooming away without making any attempt to communicate with me about my plans for the weekend. Make me sick, both of you. I have a good mind to dump the kids back on you and drive away. Call me. We have a lot to talk about, asshole. And come pick up your 4 children that you're working so hard to have custody of. Congratulations. You can have them." Unquote. While all of this shit was happening between Betty and Dan, their children were literally in the middle of all of this, and they were seeing and hearing everything that Betty would say about Dan and what Dan and Linda would say about Betty. They would hear the messages on the answering machine that Betty left. These poor kids were being shredded by the 2 people who were supposed to protect them at all costs. But these 2 adults couldn't see past their own feelings to see what they were doing to their kids. As many children do with divorce, the Broderick children started blaming themselves for their parents' breakup and for the horrible things that their parents were saying and doing. In time, the 2 Broderick daughters started turning to drugs to help ease the pain of what they had to live with, and the 2 sons were both reported to be on the verge of suicide by school counselors. But even this didn't stop Betty or Dan in the slightest. And I'm going to call it now. Both Betty and Dan are shit snakes. The following is an excerpt of a conversation between Betty and, at the time, 12-year-old Danny. I don't know why this was taped or who taped it, but regardless, it was taped. Danny begs his mother to quit screaming at Dad so his dad would let him visit her again. Quote, I was the best mummy in the whole world and the best wife in the whole world. It's not my fault your father is such a fuckhead. I cared about my family enough to put up with him fucking Linda for 2 years." Unquote. That's disgusting. Just a few years before, Betty was a doting mother, and the last thing she would have ever done would be to intentionally hurt her children. But now, Betty was a volcano, seething with loathing and always fiercely bubbling in a position to erupt. According to Bella Stumbo's book about this case, she states that by 1988, Betty had become completely consumed with rage and the want of revenge. She wasn't focused or cared for that matter on anything, not even herself. Stumbo stated, "It was now a radically changed Betty Broderick abroad in the streets of La Jolla. All personal vanity was gone, buried beneath layers of fat. Her language was now so routinely crude that even in polite gatherings, old friends lectured her about her foul mouth. By then, she was pacing the floors of her house all night. Her mind gave her no rest. The late-night demons besetting her were relentless, vicious, and growing even larger." By this point, Betty only had 2 friends left, Diane Black and Ronnie Brown, and these 2 women were only acquainted with Betty because they were advocates for a woman's rights divorce society. Diane and Ronnie tried to morally support Betty and help her get some legal advice, but Betty refused to take any legal advice from anyone. At this point, she believed that Dan had every lawyer poised to get her. When the time came to actually go to divorce court, Betty had refused any and all legal advice from anyone and everyone and decided to represent herself. Needless to say, that was a huge mistake. Dan's team of lawyers pounced on Betty like a lioness catching prey. The 8-day divorce trial resembled a brutal massacre. Betty told the court that she wanted custody of the 3 children who were still under the age of 18, and she wanted $25,000 a month from Dan for 10 years and a $1 million tax-free payment when the divorce was finalized, which actually wasn't that much money considering the immense amount of fortune Dan had. During the trial, 2 doctors took the stand to testify to their opinions regarding the custody of the Broderick children. A Dr. William Dess testified that Dan should be awarded full custody of the children because he had diagnosed Betty as suffering emotional issues which caused her to be unstable, and Betty required intense therapy, during which she would not be able to properly care for the children. The other doctor, a Dr. Gerald Nelson, I think I said that right, testified that Betty should be awarded custody of the children because he felt that once the divorce was finalized, her trauma would also end, and at that time, Betty would return to the doting mother of days past. Both doctors testified to the court that the Broderick divorce had been rife with immaturity, dishonesty, and violence on the parts of both parents, which in turn had done nothing but traumatize all the Broderick children. You think? Throughout this whole nightmare of a divorce, and because Betty continued acting the way she had been acting, literally attacking Dan and Linda at every chance she got, Dan implemented a system of fines for Betty, and he would take the amount of the fine out of her monthly support check. I don't know how he got away with this, but he did. According to an LA Times article, Dan would fine Betty $100 for every curse word she used, either in her messages or in person. $250 every time she set foot on his property, $500 for every time she entered his house, and $1,000 for every time she took one of the kids without his permission. At one point during this shitstorm of a divorce, Betty ended up owing Dan $1,300 because of all the fines she had racked up in a month. In California at the time, there was something called Epstein credits. In layman's terms, these credits are something that the supporting spouse, that is the one who makes more money, in this case, that would be Dan, can accumulate. An Epstein credit is essentially one half of a debt that should be paid by both spouses. But because they're in a divorce proceeding, the spouse that pays the debt can charge the other their half, and this amount comes out of any payment that the supporting spouse would make to the recipient spouse. So, for example, let's say Dan and Betty bought a car when they were married and they had to take out a loan for the car. Well, once Dan and Betty separated, the loan would have to be paid off. So Dan would pay the entirety of the loan, but he would then take Betty's share of the payout of that loan out of any money that he was ordered by the court to pay to her for alimony or child support or whatever. And this is effective from the date of separation of the couple. So if there's a long period of time between separation and divorce being finalized, the amount of Epstein credits can be huge. And when Dan and Betty went to court to divvy up the property and assets, Dan presented to the court that Betty owed him $750,000 in Epstein credits. And the court accepted Dan's accounting of all the payments, of all the community debts, and Betty ended up receiving less than $30,000 from Dan after 20 years of marriage. To say Betty was pissed would be, you'd be right. The blow of a pathetic $30,000 payment was the final fuck you from Dan to Betty. And with that, the divorce was finalized in January of 1989. But then, in April of 1989, just 3 months later, Dan and Linda were married. Betty had left a message threatening to kill Dan when she found out about the upcoming nuptials. So Dan and Linda thought it best to have an army of security guards at the wedding to ensure that Betty didn't ruin their special day. Betty never showed at the wedding, which is maybe one of the only good decisions that Betty ever made in her life. But she was still constantly leaving horrible messages on the answering machine for Dan and Linda. Linda, for the most part, would laugh off all of Betty's threats and her messages, which of course she did in front of the kids, who would then tell their mom, which would just infuriate Betty even more and make Betty call even more with more horrible messages. Does anyone else see a pattern here? On November 5th, 1989, about 4:30 in the morning, Betty was in her kitchen. Her 2 boys, who were at her place for the weekend, were still sleeping. She was sipping her coffee and looking at the 2 latest legal letters splayed out on the table in front of her. The letters were, of course, from the fuckhead Dan, who was pissed that Betty kept leaving messages on the machine telling him and Linda exactly what types of pieces of shit they were. One of the letters stated that because Betty continued to show signs of a pathological obsession with her now ex-husband Dan, she was therefore not in the right frame of mind to fulfill the latest child custody obligations, meaning Dan was going to try and stop her visitations with the kids. The other letter, also from Dan's legal team, chastised her for using foul language on Big Shot Dan's telephone answering machine. Betty quietly got up from the table, got dressed, grabbed her purse, and headed to the car. She drove directly to Dan and Linda's house, parked the car, and walked up to the front door. She tried the handle, but it was locked, of course. But Betty had stolen one of her daughter's house keys a few months earlier. She dug in her purse and tried the key in the lock. It didn't open. Betty decided to go around back and try the key in another door, because there was no way that Dan would have changed the locks because one of the kids lost their house key. Betty got to the back door of the house. She turned the key, and click, the lock opened and Betty was in. She took a look around the beautiful mansion for just a quick second, then reached into her purse again and pulled out a .38 Smith & Wesson. It was now 5:30 in the morning. She quickly made her way up to Dan and Linda's bedroom. She opened the door and saw them both in bed asleep. She aimed for Linda first and shot the sleeping woman once. Linda's body jerked as the bullet hit her in the chest. Betty fired again, hitting Linda in the head. Linda died instantly. By this point, Dan was awake. He mumbled something towards Betty and tried to roll off the bed. Dan let out a scream as the bullet pierced through his back. He started gagging as his body hit the floor. Betty fired 2 more shots, but she missed her target with both. One bullet hit the nightstand above where Dan lay, and the other slammed into the wall. Dan started choking and spitting blood. Betty watched as he slowly choked to death on the floor of his bedroom. Betty removed the phone from Dan and Linda's bedroom, just in case he wasn't dead, and tried to call for help. She went downstairs, called her daughter Lee, then drove herself to the police station and turned herself in. Betty told the police that she never intended to kill them that morning. She only wanted to try and make all this horrible stuff stop. She stated that she had only taken the gun to protect herself in case Linda or Dan attacked her. Sure. But then in court, Betty testified that her plan was to use the gun to make them listen, and then she was going to kill herself in the bedroom as they watched. But when they woke up, they moved, and Betty stated that it startled her, and it was over before she knew what was happening. The Broderick murders drew insane amounts of attention from the media, and Betty granted interviews to anyone who wanted one, trying to gain the public's sympathy and support. From inside her jail cell, the old Betty started to reemerge. It was as if the nasty, vindictive, violent Betty had disappeared as soon as Dan and Linda took their last breaths. Betty's trial began on October 22, 1990. Her attorney, Jack Early, in his opening remarks, told the jury and the family and friends and reporters who had packed into the courtroom that he could and would prove Betty was not the aggressor, but a woman pushed to a nervous breakdown by Dan Broderick's snowstorm of paper, a litigious assault that started somewhere around 1985. Dan Broderick was really the hunter, whose reputation as a lawyer was the most important thing to him, more important than his family, and he would do anything to protect it. The prosecutor, Carrie Wells, a female prosecutor, specifically chosen because she was a female, stated to the jury that the entire case was about premeditated murder and nothing else. Wells stated to the jury, killing Dan and Linda Broderick was something that Betty thought about for a long, long time. Dan and Betty's 2 daughters, Kim and Lee, ages 20 and 19 respectively, testified at the trial. By the time Betty murdered Dan and Linda, both of the girls had distanced themselves as much as they could from both their parents. Kim and Lee both testified that on several occasions, Betty had told them both that she wanted to kill Dan and Linda. As well, Kim brought up a $1 million insurance policy that was payable to the 4 children that the court had ordered Dan to purchase during the divorce. That insurance policy had come into effect just 2 months before the murder. According to Kim, Betty told all 4 of the children, "I'll kill him and we'll all be rich." The prosecution called a Dr. Ruth Roth to testify. Dr. Roth was a family therapist, and in 1987, she had been hired to counsel Betty and Dan for the marital problems that the couple were having. On the stand, Dr. Roth described Betty as a woman of uncontrollable anger. She stated that during their session, Betty stated, quote, "I'm not going to be a single parent of 4 kids. He'll die first," unquote. But when Dr. Roth was asked by the defense counsel to describe Dan for the court, Dr. Roth couldn't say anything about Dan because she had forgotten to take notes during the session. Wait, what? How did she have notes on Betty then? Interesting. As for Betty's 2 daughters, when cross-examined, Early, Betty's lawyer, was able to get both daughters to admit that Betty would often say she was going to kill people, kind of like a figure of speech, like, "I'm going to kill the mailman if he doesn't remember to close the door to the mailbox," that kind of thing. As well, Early was able to get Kim to admit that Dan also had a horrible temper, and that one time he had smashed a lawnmower to bits and pieces because he couldn't get it to work properly. Betty's lawyer even had an expert on infidelity, a Dr. David Lusterman, testify, whose diagnosis was basically that Dan had handled Betty all wrong, thus driving her to instability. Holy fucking victim blaming, Batman. By the way, this expert, Dr. Lusterman, had never met Dan or Betty. He made this diagnosis from reading the case file after Betty had killed Dan and Linda. Then Betty herself took the stand. She sat on the stand and looked like an all-American housewife who wouldn't hurt a fly. She smiled politely with no hint of the evil and vindictive bitch that she had been towards Dan and Linda throughout the entire divorce. Early walked Betty through the years of her marriage to Dan, him falling in love with Linda, leaving the family, how little he cared for both Betty and the children. At times, Betty was sobbing while testifying. But then, Betty turned the waterworks on full blast when she was describing what she was thinking the morning of the murders while she was sitting in her kitchen reading those 2 last letters from Dan's lawyer. Quote, "They were just more of the same, more of the same, more of the same. Threats, manipulation. I felt like I was dying. The legal stuff was killing me. I had not slept for the last 2 years. I had headaches from biting my jaw so tight from stress." Unquote. Betty couldn't remember much about the murders themselves, but she did recall driving to Dan and Linda's, thinking for a fleeting moment that she might even kill herself in front of him, splattering her brains across his bedroom. Quote, "I pushed the bedroom door open. They moved, I moved, and it was over. When I was first in jail, I was able to sleep for the first time in what seemed like years to me. I was happy to be locked in a dark, safe little world where nobody could get me." Unquote. The jury deliberated for 4 days and came back split. 2 members of the jury felt that Betty was not guilty of premeditated murder, and those 2 jurors were not going to change their minds no matter what was said to them. One of the 2 jurors stated later that he felt Betty was not guilty of premeditation, that as he listened to the court's description of Dan Broderick's infidelity, snobbishness, and psychological brutality, His only thought throughout much of the proceedings was, what took her so long? Dude. Oh, that's not okay for a juror to say. Betty's second trial started in October 1991, 12 months after the first trial ended in a hung jury. Betty had spent another year in prison and seemed to be coping well with what she was dealing with on the inside. She had made friends and participated in programs, saw her boys when they were brought to visit. But then, right before the trial, something happened. Betty had gotten into a fight with two female prison guards. The prison guards came to her cell to move her to an isolation unit as punishment for an earlier infraction. Refusing to cooperate and go to isolation, Betty apparently kicked, howled, and struggled and had to be forcibly evicted from her cell, wearing nothing but panties and a sweatshirt. Details of this incident are really hard to find. The only thing I could find was basically what I just said. There's no other details. It just seems weird. And by some way, the following morning headlines in the media said that Betty was once again exhibiting her old defiant ways. Jack Early, Betty's lawyer, cried foul, stating that the entire thing was a setup to make Betty look like a violent person before the trial started, most likely set up by associates of Dan's who would have connections with those in power within the prison system. But nothing ever came of those accusations. Right after the incident in the prison and the headlines that followed, Betty gave an interview with 2020, I'm sure was set up by her lawyer, with the intention to try and save face and show the world this demure, helpless housewife who had been abused for so many years. Betty stated in the interview that, quote, the law has to take into account the differences between men and women in terms of their respective power. Men have all the power. That's why Dan could do to me what he did. This whole case is a story of extremes. Extremes of rich to poor and all the rest. I represent the extremes of what can happen to women in divorce courts. Unquote. The second trial of Betty Broderick was pretty much the same as the first one, except for a few things. This time, the prosecutor, Carrie Wells, was more relaxed when speaking to the jury and cross-examining witnesses. As well, the judge this time seemed to favor the prosecution and was very limiting in what Early's expert witnesses could and could not testify to. Early stated that he found himself having to work up a hill, so to speak, to get the point that Betty was abused across to the jury members. And then Betty's attorney brought forth a witness that caused the prosecution's heads to explode. A city cab driver named Paul Taylor had come forward stating that Dan had approached him and offered him $500,000 to do away permanently with his bitch of an ex-wife. But before anyone could say shit snake, the judge objected and banned Taylor from testifying. As well, the judge banned any and all talk of a hitman or hitmen during the trial. According to the judge, Taylor would only produce misleading cues. And this was Betty's trial for murder, not Dan's. But it seems that even without the cabbie hitman's testimony, Earl was able to plant some seeds of doubt inside the minds of jurors. After deliberations, the jury came back with a guilty verdict of second-degree murder, not first degree, which is what the prosecution was hoping for. They kind of had to find Betty guilty of something because she had never denied killing Dan and Linda. The only thing that this trial was really all about was whether Betty had planned in advance the murders or not. When handing down her sentence, the judge stated that Betty's struggle was recognized, but the court condemned the way that she went about resolving it. Betty had never expected to walk out of court free, but the 2 consecutive 15-year to life sentences she received wouldn't allow her parole for 19 years. She wasn't expecting that. Today, Betty Broderick spends her days inside the California Institute for Women. She has appeared before the parole board twice, and each time they have denied her request for parole. On November 7th this year, Betty Broderick will turn 77. She will be eligible for parole again the year she turns 85. Her sons are split on whether their mother should be released from prison. In an interview on Oprah, Rhett, her youngest son, stated that he hoped that one day his mother would be released because keeping her in prison is not really helping her. He stated that she isn't a danger to society because the only 2 people she was ever a danger to are dead. Her older son Daniel stated to the parole board in 2010 that he felt his mom was still hung up on justifying the 2 murders. He stated that, quote, "In my heart, I know my mother is a good person, but along the way she got lost, and releasing a lost person into society could be a dangerous mistake," unquote. And that is the case of Dan and Betty Broderick. Tragic from any way you look at it. My thoughts. Who was the guilty party in this case? Was it Betty, a woman who slaved to put her husband through both medical and law school while working, raising his family, and keeping the house? Or was it Dan, who fell in love with another woman, left Betty with nothing, and then relentlessly slammed her with his knowledge of the legal system? A knowledge which, by the way, he wouldn't have without Betty in the first place. I think that they're both guilty. Guilty of being horrible shit rats. They were both so focused on damaging the other one and getting revenge on each other that they lost sight of what was important: their children. They both exhibited a profound disregard for the well-being of their own kids. Both Dan and Betty were guilty of perpetuating the cycle of trauma that existed within that family. Dan was an absolute shit snake, and Betty deserved better than what happened to her in the divorce. But that doesn't give Betty the right to take Dan's life and the life of Linda. Personally, I have never understood jealousy, especially jealousy over a person. If someone doesn't want to be in a relationship with me, that's their problem, not mine. 'Cause I know that I'm a fucking ray of sunshine and I have things I want to do in my life. And if they don't want to join me for the ride, fuck 'em. But I do know that jealousy does play in a lot of people's lives. I consider myself fortunate that I don't ever suffer from jealousy over a person. I get jealous over people with nicer houses than mine and nicer cars, but not over a person. Violent or abusive relationships, whether it be physical, emotional, or psychological violence, seem to have a tendency to turn both partners into monsters. First, the one causing the violence is already a monster coming in, but then the one who is on the receiving side also becomes a monster in retaliation. They both need to come to a realization of what consequences their behaviors have on those around them. Unfortunately for the Broderick children, who lost both of their parents that day, Dan and Betty's actions were steeped in selfishness and manipulation, and neither of them were able to have those realizations before it was too late. When a woman deviates from the traditional gendered stereotype of the loving nurturer, it often draws intense scrutiny and attention from the media and the public. Such cases can provoke polarized opinions. The coverage of the Broderick case saw Betty's actions as being opposite to the typical image of femininity. For many in the public court of opinion, Betty embodied the victim of a harsh and oppressive relationship, deserving of sympathy and understanding. Conversely, others viewed Dan as the true victim in the narrative, a man struggling against the consequence of a tumultuous relationship. A bitter divorce often initiates a descent into chaos and tends to reveal the darker sides of human beings. Betty became a whirlwind of jealousy and rage. Her inability to let go of Dan manifested into increasingly erratic and violent behavior. The case of the Broderick should be a reminder to all of us of exactly what can happen when resentment, jealousy, and thoughts of vengeance go unchecked. Betty became the architect of her own downfall, leaving behind a chilling tale of insanity that forever echoes through every life it touched. Well, I actually kind of gave myself chills on that final paragraph. Whew! What a horrible case. What a waste of lives and waste of opportunities for happiness. Seriously, people, if you're not happy with who you're with, move on. There are how many billions of people on this planet? There's someone out there who will make you happy somewhere. You just have to be willing to look for them. With that, I think we'll leave it there for this week. Stay safe, get your pap tests, and enjoy your day today. This has been a Bitter Witness production.